Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Super excited to bring in a slightly new and different topic that I'm sure probably few people have heard of. I mean, or at least delved into any considerable length, right? Which is this concept of the Flâneur. Now, before we start, I'm not even going to go into what a Flâneur is. What I want to ask you guys is a fundamental question, which is basically the context within which the Flâneur exists. And that is the city. So my question is, guys, is thinking about the modern city, thinking about what, like the environment that we live in, what do we understand as a modern city? What defines a city? What is the purpose of a city? And what does it kind of create for us? What does city mean to you?
I mean, millions of people. It sounds like where you feel like there's got to be a minimum population.
Yeah, massive crowd of humans stuffed together.
Yeah.
Okay. Culture, entertainment, media, stimulation. Okay, so people, hub.
City provides opportunities for evolving.
Exactly, opportunities for growth, opportunities for expansion, commerce, economy, all of this stuff, the land of opportunity. Anything else that a city does?
For me, it's like
Now we're getting somewhere, yeah. Architecture, right? The sights, the sounds, the buildings, the feel of a place. What makes...
Best ideas are in the city.
Yeah, a vision
It's
as
almost
well.
like forced growth because people come from all around and then they start to go up in height.
Exactly, which we literally get with skyscrapers, right? The growing, expanding monster of the big city, right?
the access.
Education.
You don't have to go to like everything is already
Everything's catered for you, right?
comfortable.
Yeah. So
There's a path
privilege.
already.
Yeah,
There's a path already done for you.
Convenience, privilege. Right, you guys are nailing it.
I was gonna say freedom of expression.
Freedom as well. Freedom of all these things that the city represents, right? So obviously cities don't come out of thin air, right? Cities are a product that happens over a long period of time. We have people together, we have these building, evolving monsters. They start like a baby and they grow into full-fledged adults that we know and enjoy and have done for the last several hundred years, right? And so in order to help you guys understand the Flâneur in particular, I want to contextualize it and put the Flâneur within its situation, which is Paris, right? What do you guys think of when you think of 19th century Paris?
Dirty.
Dirty. Mm-hmm.
Romance.
Really?
Romantic.
Yeah, romance. No, this is exactly it. Romance. So Paris is like this shadowy, romantic kind of backland, right? That has all of these sort of evolving ideas, the little streets, the promenades, the boulevards, the avenues, right? So this is the beginning of Paris, which we know quickly evolved into its kind of Belle Epoque sort of era, right? Paris being this kind of, like you said, the romantic, beautiful city of the architecture, the cobbled streets, the lights, the corners, the intrigue, but also Paris being this sort of labyrinth where everything is possible, where nothing is really set, nothing's arranged. It's this kind of stunning, maze that even to this day draws people to Paris every year, right? The idea of like you can get lost in Paris, the classic idea. And so Paris is also famous for having these things called arcades. So the idea of like the Les Arcades, or I'm not going to try to do French, but the idea that you can walk down, you have all these different shops side by side, people interacting and speaking. This was like kind of mid-19th century Paris, the early 1800s onwards. This is where people would come to rearrange and to sort of join together from all class and creed. And then you'd have things like the commercial areas, the little areas lit up by night. Paris basically being this wonderland, and also a place of affluence. People with quite a lot of money, people in this, post-industrial, people starting to gain a lot of money and having spare time to do hobbies, time to walk around, go for a stroll around Paris, the pleasure gardens, all this kind of stuff, right? And here you've got a painting of sort of the classic scenes you get in Paris, people walking around with an umbrella. And it's from specifically this context that the concept and figure, more accurately, of the Flâneur emerges. Now, has anyone ever heard of a Flâneur? Does anyone know what I even mean when I say a Flâneur?
Only by reading it off the description.
Exactly, yeah. Everyone's come up to me like, what the hell is a Flâneur? Yeah, exactly. What is a Flâneur? Like, I never really learned it properly myself because it's a kind of a rare and weird figure, but it's basically a quintessentially French figure of modernity. So what the Flâneur was, a Flâneur means the gentleman stroller of the city streets. So you can imagine a rich, affluent 19th century Paris. You'd have this Flaneur type figure, probably with his top hat, with his sort of nice waistcoat, and he'd just be walking around the street observing stuff, okay? Looking at everyone, looking at the prostitutes in the corner, looking at the rich eating in the streets, looking at the beggars, looking at the kings, looking at every type of person across society. So a few of my favorite kind of quotations is a bourgeois man of the crowd. Okay? He was a man of money, man of time on his hands, and a man who could spend time with the masses. He was a loiterer and a fritterer away of time. Somebody who just liked to spend their time people watching, liked to observe, liked to understand and read his city, understand all the elegance and the underbelly of Parisian life. I love this one. A man of money whose hours were free. So the idea that he has money, so he has time. He has time to just piss around, see people, inspect, maybe write a few notes about people. This is a kind of idle man of leisure and pleasure. I also like the botanist of the pavements. So he would also study. He would also try to observe the faces of all the different people and try to build up a mental picture of the city that he inhabited. So this was your Flaneur type figure. Now, of course, Flaneurs were always men, firstly. And we're going to talk about this later, but Flaneurs were not women. If you were a woman back in 19th century France, walking around or anywhere in the world, alone, loitering, you would be seen either you're a prostitute, a no-gooder, or you're in grave danger. The man, this was a very white, privileged role of being the observer of the people. And here we have some images from, classical French art of Flaneurs and what they would do with their binoculars, with their moustaches. Now, they'd often dress in fancy ways, but often they wouldn't. They'd try to blend in with the crowd, keep anonymous, be a bit of a fly on the wall, this kind of thing. And I love this picture particularly because it actually inspired kind of what I'm going to try to make the argument of, which is that the Flaneur, he kind of sees his landscape, he sees his physical landscape, specifically the city, as a text. It's a book that should be read and reread, studied, learned, noted. It's not a physical space, it's an intellectual space with which he can understand and become better at, right? So he would peruse his city like we might read a book, taking notes, highlighting things, rereading things. So this is the kind of gentleman stroller walking through his sort of literary text that is the city. And the reason why we have this term Flaneur, I mean, it's kind of, the origins of as everything is sort of disputed. But the main reason why we have this term is because of this guy Baudelaire, who was a famous French poet, and he wrote many beautiful and kind of influential works, amongst them The Painter of Modern Life, which is where he essentially elevated the Flaneur, and the figure of the Flaneur, as being a true artist and a true emblem of modern man. He was a figure who represented the middle class, time on your hands, curiosity in the big city that kind of captured what the time was about, the zeitgeist. And he has a couple of really interesting quotations I'm going to read to you quickly, which is, "The crowd is his element, as the air is that of the birds and the water of fishes. His passion and profession are to become one flesh with the crowd. For the perfect Flaneur, it is an immense joy to set up house in the heart of the multitude, the masses, amid the ebb and flow of movement, and in the midst of the fugitive and the infinite." So in a classical, poetic-y way, he's basically saying this guy loves to be in a crowd. And also to be away from home, and yet to feel oneself everywhere at home. To see the world, to be at the center of the world, and yet to remain hidden from the world. So this idea of the anonymous solitude figure, who's also invested in the city and the vast expanse of people and energy and stuff that's happening around him. And so the Flaneur, he had his heyday, like he had a long period of time as Paris especially was evolving. It became more and more exciting, right? The city was this adventure playground. You can go and look around and explore more and more attractions, more and more things to see, more people, more immigrants, more poverty, more riches, everything. It becomes this fascinating locus of his attention. But then suddenly, almost overnight, not quite, but almost overnight, this figure of the Flaneur just disappears. He ceases to exist. And my question to you guys before moving on is why? Why do we think the Flaneur just suddenly disappears?
When this happened?
This would have been in the mid-19th century. So like 18... late 1800s gone, 19th century. No, sorry, yeah, late 1800s gone. By the 20th century, it's gone. It's something to do with the growth of the city. What do we think? What would have ruined his habitat?
The speed of the city after the Industrial Revolution.
The size of things, yeah.
The size of things. Yeah, the speed, the size.
The price going up of living.
Yeah. You can loiter around nowadays.
Yeah.
Exactly, the price of things going up. And so, you've all kind of hit the nail on the head. But the real thing I'm getting at here is that architecture affects how we think, and of course it affects how we live. And so in Paris, there were these crazy, massive reforms when all these little windy, uncertain, mysterious, shadowy streets that we know to love from the films and the poems suddenly become replaced by these massive boulevards, widened, made more hygienic, better for people, better for cars, made bigger, wider, but also less personal, less intimate, less familiar. And from this, we go as far as, this map of London. You see how cities evolve to meet the increasing demand of people. They become less and less suited for loitering and exploring, and more wide and almost too big. You get lost in the space. Secondly, we talked about the arcade and how he loved the arcade. Now, of course, the arcade died out and it was replaced by the department store. And the idea is why do we need to have people on the street talking to each other like a marketplace when we can have a store with specific stuff? And then of course the market store evolves into the shopping mall we have today. And how many of you guys hang around shopping malls meeting people and inspecting people? You don't. You know where it is.
Yeah, it's high school.
Exactly. Not since high school. You know where stuff is, you know what you want, you go for it, it's signposted, it's no longer a space of intrigue, mystery, or exploration. Same with the streets, which used to, of course, be for pedestrians only. Then they became motor cities. They became cities designed for cars. And I always use the example here of Los Angeles, because Los Angeles is the first city, I think, designed for cars, not for humans. So you actually have street views that are designed to be viewed from a windscreen window rather than from your own eyes. It's not designed for people, it's designed for cars. And so you get this idea of people losing that wandering, loitering, walking through the street vibe. It goes. And that's also why I think LA is a bit of a shithole city, because it's just one giant car park. Of course, you have more practical things like street signs. We just need practical things. You've got more people need to know where to go. Suddenly, your maps, mystery, getting lost, it doesn't really work anymore. We need to be told where things are. We need to have metro systems. We need to have these different ways to guide us around the city. And then more importantly, loitering itself becomes a kind of crime. It becomes a felony. You get loitering. These are some photos taken from London. Everywhere, no loitering, no loitering, no loitering. People don't like some stranger sitting on the step of their room. People don't like a stranger sitting in a park watching people. It's not really, it kind of became something that was seen as criminal, or something that was seen as at least suspicious. People became more paranoid around loitering. And so basically, everything that the Flaneur needed to thrive on got taken away by the growing pace of the city. Also, in terms of our psychology, cities somewhere along the line shifted from being these really exciting, buzzing places to explore to being more transitional. We all have somewhere that we need to get to, so we have the commutes, we have the idea that we have to get there, and the city becomes almost like an obstacle between us and where we want to be, rather than being a sort of playground that we can explore and move around. So we also became much more efficient in the city. Cities became about hubs of industry, productivity, commerce. They didn't become places of leisure, which is, why we see reducing sizes of parks. We see people building more and more skyrise. They want to make the city this efficient beast, as opposed to being a kind of idle Flaneur type person. And so we wouldn't really know about this or care about this if it wasn't for the work of people much later down the line. And we can talk about it in the discussion, but mainly this German critical theorist called Walter Benjamin, which I don't think sounds very German, but he was German. Good old Walter. But he wrote this thing called the Arcades Project, which is basically, he became fascinated with the Flaneur and actually wrote sort of a nostalgic piece looking at what was lost with the arcades and going through the old Parisian arcades and saying what we had here was special, effectively, and we've kind of lost that with the advent of industry, and more specifically with the advent of capitalism. the fact that nowadays things have become more brutal, more efficient, and less communal and shared. We also have these guys who are some stereotypically pretentious French philosophers called the Situationalists, and they were like in the 50s, 60s time, and these guys basically became obsessed with the idea of the city has become the thing that controls us. We no longer enjoy and control the city. It controls us, guides us, determines our lives. And they kind of try to break away from that. They thought about it. How can we break away from this deterministic universe of the city? And so they started graffiti places. So I like this one here, which is sous les pavés la plage, which is below the pavement, the beach, or the beach. The idea of like, we are not living in this concrete jungle. We have a beautiful beach beneath us. Let's enjoy it. Let's enjoy our city again. Their big philosophy was like, the city should be a playground. It must be a playground. Otherwise, it is a space of capitalist control. Other ones that they have here was ne travaillez jamais or whatever. Don't work anymore. Which is even a more kind of, radical, and also probably quite counterproductive and very philosophical. Very like philosophy undergraduate or whatever. But they didn't want anyone to work, and they were kind of saying to people, we don't need to be part of the system. It is cruel, and it is not for our interest. Psychologically, it's fucking us up as well. And he also came with this fascinating concept of psychogeography. And psychogeography, in like my little delve into it, is basically the idea that why should we have our geography, like the way we look at things, particularly in the city, determined by governments or corporations or maps or anything physical and linear and objective that says this is where you are, this is your boundary. Their idea was, well, no, your geography should be determined by how you see yourself in the world, how you see it. And so, of course, it was very abstract, very philosophical, but they did some cool kind of projects, like they would go around and rip up maps of Paris or rip up maps of London and walk around and build their own maps based on sort of, I don't want this to go to there, I want it to go via there. And they would kind of wander aimlessly following a mantra that they called le dérive, which is the drift, which is trying to drift away from linear, constructed way of thinking, and basically ripping up the map. They also did stuff like they would take a map of London and try to go around a city in Germany using the map of London. So they would basically say, like, fuck you to people that are trying to control the way they think and interact with a city. And there's a really good book about this if anyone's interested, called Psychogeography by Will Self. He kind of tracks this idea, and he's a 21st century Flaneur. He sees himself as this kind of a figure. But you can also see in the artwork the kind of things we mean by psychogeography. It's kind of surrealist. It's sort of like, I think it looks really cool as well. Someone could get like tattooed on their arm or something. But it's the idea of like, why does it have to be set? Why can't it mean, oh, this is like a money-ish place and this is surveillance, this is more like love? Why can't people have this kind of much more abstract way of perceiving their cities? After all, it's my city, it's your city, it's his and her city. It's not the city, it should be our city, individually. This is some of the art. But they kind of failed, obviously, as you can imagine. People don't see themselves in this way. Of course, it was very French avant-garde, and we don't really subscribe to this way of seeing ourselves. It's not practical, it's not effective, but most importantly, it just doesn't reflect the way we are trained to think these days. And the way we're trained to think is this metric of time equals money. This idea that we don't want to spend time loitering nowadays. We're so constructed by our cities that we want to use and move through our environment efficiently. Any time that we spend loitering around is wasted money. And that guy, Will Self, had a beautiful analogy where he basically said that human beings, we are all like our own personal taxi drivers, in that we are constantly making a calculation of our time spent versus money we get. So we're constantly making, is it financially or is it beneficial to me, this effort? We're constantly on our taxis thinking in this way. And that's a gradual process of how the architecture of the cities, how the highways and the boulevards and these things have shaped us. We now think in terms of we want to get where we want to get to as fast as we can. Another massive thing that has, I would argue, changed the way we view cities, which has everything to do with technology, of course, is that we've essentially, since the advent of smartphones, we've stopped interacting with the physical space around us. And for us, London, for example, isn't really this anymore. Maybe for a second when we look up at this, but London has become this. And this is how the majority of us interact with our spaces, is that we view it through a little phone and a GPS. If we want to go from there to there, we start seeing the city like this. And in philosophy, that's called like hyperrealism. The idea of that we have this kind of hyper-real representation of the world, but it's not real. But for us, this London that you're seeing right now is just as real as the physical London that we go through. The maps have become real for us. And I think that's also really fascinating in how it's changed the way we view things, particularly when it comes to building references and this idea of psychogeography, creating emotions with architecture, buildings, light, places, people. Now it's all reduced to this little screen. And this podcast guy that I like, Blind Boy, he had this beautiful analogy of that as well, which he said in the video game Grand Theft Auto, the creators of that game spent years upon years upon years making this beautiful landscape of LA or of New York or whatever city, with all the details and all of the little things and the people and the places. Yet when you're driving in your car through this beautiful creation that a team of hundreds of people spent years designing, you're just looking at your little map in the corner trying to guide yourself around, and everything else is lost. And so I think that is basically our relationship with cities in particular nowadays. It's like you have this insane spectacle all around you at all times, yet we don't interact with it anymore like that. We interact with it only through this efficiency-obsessed, time, money, calculating A to Z. And so the kind of question that we're kind of leading into now is there any hope? Like, has the Flaneur spirit or archetype completely died? Is it gone? Does it not have a function anymore? Is it lost? And I looked around and I wanted it to not be true, but I found some interesting ideas, which is that we've entered the age of the cyberflowners. That actually we can be cyberflowners now, that we can actually have this same relationship, but through our phones, through technology. And so there were some really optimistic articles in 2012. Literally, I don't know why, like 5 articles in 2012 all came up, all discussing the rise of the cyberflowneur. And everyone was super excited about the idea of, oh, we're going to be flaneurs again. We have these new technologies where we can explore, we can have fun, where we can do this stuff. And they talked about it with examples like clicking on things, clicking on a link. In early internet in the 90s, you click on a link, you don't know what the fuck's going to come up. You don't know. And it's a bit of an adventure each time. You're clicking your way, and it's kind of random, and it's kind of surreal, and it's certainly psychologically closer to the idea of getting lost in alleyways and things like that, because you have an impossibly large world and no plan. The second thing that they use as an example is eBay. The idea of like a flaneur would often go to flea markets and look at all the crazy curiosities that people are selling and kind of analyze that stuff. In early eBay, it was the same thing. You had these bizarre, anything you wanted to, you can go and browse there. And you also get this kind of, let's say, optimistic, hopeful vision of the internet with terms like this is called Internet Explorer, right? The early form, the idea was that you would explore the internet. The internet was something for you to like put your backpack and binoculars and go out and explore and discover. Internet Explorer. Or something like this old term, surf the internet. This kind of makes me think of that earlier one, which is like, under the pavement there's a beach. It's that idea of like, maybe it should be pura vida on the internet. We should all be surfing, chilling. Like that's what the internet's about. It's about riding waves, having fun. But then all of this optimism of 2012, again, kind of died. Why do we think? What singular thing do you think destroyed any hope we had of the internet being this wonderful free world where everything is possibilities?
Commerce.
Yeah, commerce, before commerce. Think about the efficiency thing.
Connected like the infrastructure.
Oh, the Google search, man. The Google search. The Google search. The idea that the internet shouldn't be this place. Because remember, the internet is just, obviously, we know it's so young. But somewhere along the line, very quickly, we as people decided the internet should not be this crazy adventure. to be digitally lived online. It has to be this efficient, brutal, organized machine, just like the city. It has to be a city. It can't be a fun town. It can't be Disneyland. It has to be a city. And so they created this ever-evolving, ever-smarter search engine that literally gets you directly to where you want to go. You don't go through, who goes through, when you guys are doing research or anything, do you go through websites anymore? If you want to know something, do you like look through websites, or do you just type it in and Google gives you the
I
answer?
don't even go to page 3 of Google.
Exactly, yeah. Page 3 of Google is probably the biggest adventure you can have.
Sometimes I even like click on a link and then just search the term, so I don't read the whole article.
Yeah.
Sometimes they give you like excerpts, like different ways that people ask a question, like for example, like is it cool to stay in Pais? And then you just click on it and give you an excerpt, and I just read this and I'm done.
Yeah,
Exactly. I don't even get into the
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's like I would say that's the digital landscape equivalent of getting into the train or subway, and then you go and then you get off at your stop and then you're done. And all that interaction is just completely instrumental. It doesn't have any value in itself. So you have that, but then even worse than the sort of search engine as well, is that even if you want to kind of be a bit more deviant, maybe you want to take a little bit of a derive and move off piste, then you have the whole "did you mean" pop-up as well. So if you type in something a bit different, did you? Yeah, I misspelled mass control like 4 S's and 2 O's. But yeah, even then it's like, did you mean this? Did you mean that? And it kind of really keeps you in this stay in your fucking line kind of mentality. And I would say that's an extension of the modern city. But anyway, and then like I can't remember, was it you that said ads or you that said ads? You that said ads. Commerce and ads, right? Then you've got this idea as well. It's that the internet, Google, anywhere, there is not this benevolent, wonderful world. Like old French architecture isn't trying to sell you anything, you know? Or like random people walking down trying to sell you anything, but Google, as we know, is constantly trying to sell you something. So you also can't trust it as being this free world. It's always trying to push you towards, if you want to find a nice coffee shop, it's going to push you towards a coffee shop that's been paying the most money in ads. And it's this idea that, well, we don't really live in a free world. You can't really loiter, especially if you're doing it passively, like a Flâneur might walk through the streets. You're going to be constantly pushed into someone's pocket, someone's economic interests. And then shit gets even crazier with Facebook, right? Like, I'm not going to bore you guys. We all know what Facebook is. We all know the giant that Facebook is. But we've got all of these things. I've got Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all these things which Zuckerberg and co. promise would like bring the world closer together, right? Would deliver this promised land of a kind of free and connected world where we all emerge and interact in the spirit of the Flâneur, where we can all become, like they said earlier, at one with the flesh of the masses and stuff like that. But we of course know that that isn't the case. We of course know that social media does divide people more than it brings them together and all of that. But more than anything, and this is before I go on to that, more than anything, it's what you said, it's the idea of all these things getting capitalized, becoming what this guy, Jaron Lanier, I highly recommend watching this video. It's called How We Need to Remake the Internet. It's amazing. He basically says, what social media is, or what social media networks are, is that they are behavior modification empires. They are not places, they are not spaces, they are not forums, they are empires of behavior modification. And I think that's a really powerful thing. And he basically argues that the internet had this beautiful dream. It had this beautiful utopian dream of being this free and exciting space. And it has very quickly become a city. What happened to Paris? What happened to Paris when it went from being a Flaneur's playground to being a brutal, and let's be honest, a lot of people who go to Paris these days come back and say, you know what, it was kind of shit. I kind of hated Paris. It was actually quite horrible, yeah. Paris's reputation, I'm not digging on Paris, but it rests a lot on its past, on what's been lost, not on what it is. So you get some really cool cities where people are, oh, it's amazing. I remember I did a year in Medellin, Colombia, and there was some interesting, fascinating stuff going on there. But Paris, I believe what happened to Paris is what has happened with the internet, with stuff like social media and Google. And then of course we have Meta. Who's heard of Meta? Who knows what Meta is? Yeah, has everyone at least heard of Meta? Yeah, imagine like Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Twitter, whatever, all had like some crazy orgy they would produce this shit,
Yeah.
which is meta, which is some brutal, all-encompassing sort of mega city in our internet sky that has come to create what is called the metaverse. And the metaverse is this weird guy's way of basically trying to move our interactions with the physical landscape completely over to the digital landscape. And some people would say, oh, well, you know what, if you can come in with this avatar and you can then create these worlds where everything is possible, where I can explore, I can be in Kenya 1 minute, digitally perfect rendered Kenya, and then suddenly I can be in space, maybe I can be in space playing ping pong with my friends, or I could be with some weird creatures like this, contacting people in the real world, blurring the lines between reality and, you know, people might say, well, this is great. This is a chance for us to be Flâneurs again. This is a chance for us to enjoy our spaces, to explore our spaces, to touch again with that sort of spirit that was lost in the city process. But of course, we know that this isn't the case with the metaverse. We know that it isn't an open world, it isn't an agendaless world, and it isn't a world where we can really roam for free. And it also isn't a world where we can loiter. Because if you spend time there and you're doing nothing and you're not buying anything, or you're not progressing or whatever, then you're a waste of time. You're a waste of time to them, and that's not what they encourage you to do. That's why you get all these distractions and stuff like that. No one wants you to just scroll through Instagram. No one wants you. You know, some people might say, oh, well, we are Flaneurs because we've gone from strolling the streets to scrolling Instagram. You know, that's been a great transition. But no, they don't want us to scroll. They want us to scroll and click. And so the difference is that somewhere along the line, very quickly, we lost all chances to loiter in the physical space. We created the digital space, which had promised to do the same, and we instantly lost that. So my final question is, how can we reclaim that spirit? How can we bring back some sort of like, I'm a human being and I deserve to enjoy my space for what it is. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to go anywhere. I can just chill and enjoy it. And enjoy my privilege. You know, we're all privileged. We're all essentially, you know, it was the Flâneur. Now men, women, a lot of people have free time. Why can't we enjoy that free time? And so my sort of initial suggestion before we kick off the debate would be things like urban sketching and photography. I believe are beautiful art forms. And when we've been in Mexico City, Ariel and I, we've been sketching like every day, or every week really, try to do at least twice a week. Because it's been a wonderful way to just get behind the sort of brutal treadmill of the city. And you just sit down and maybe just look at a little coffee shop. With a photography, maybe you look at a little stain that's below a fire hydrant, and you start taking interest in your surroundings again. And I'm sure there are many other ways that we can discuss, but my kind of closing remark really is, can and should we reawaken this Flâneur spirit? How psychologically important is it for us to be able to enjoy our spaces and not just be pushed through the spaces by our spaces? And lastly, what can we do to help kind of create more rewarding interactions, not only between people, but between people and the physical world around us? Thank you very much.